Okay, so you've made the decision that you're going to have a graph in your data, you feel it's necessary, and if you're not sure about how to make that decision, go and watch the companion video on deciding whether to use a graph. You can also go and watch the companion video on how to format a graph. But in this one, we're going to actually go through how to choose the right graph for the data that you're working with. And fundamentally, this is where most mistakes are made in both in student reports, but also, interestingly, in published material. Because if you pick the wrong graph, you actually end up allowing the reader to misinterpret your information. You end up miscommunicating it. And remember that the whole notion of everything we keep pushing about in these short videos is it's about taking out the ambiguity of what we do. So let's get into this. Well, one of the things to state is that you're trying to come up with something which presents the data in a meaningful way. So picking the right graph is about showing the data in an appropriate way. But they are not meant to be these just colourful eye-catching advertisements. If that's what they're doing, they're not serving their purpose. They are blatant demonstrations. So if you go and watch the companion video on formatting a graph, it's all about making it actually, black and white, large symbols, clearly labelled. And that's all really about the notion of perception. As soon as we start throwing colour or we start picking the wrong graphs, it makes it harder for us to perceive. And there is a hierarchy of perception. It's actually 7 stages of perception. And it makes it much harder for the reader to interpret what it is you're trying to get across. So when we are picking the graph, think a little bit about the size of your data set. Because that will actually have an impact on kind of the graph that you're actually going to pick. So if you've got a large data set, it's probably actually the best way to present the information. If you've got a really large data set, tables don't really seem appropriate, and it really only starts to become appropriate when you've got more than 2 variables. But if you've got a big data set, you can imagine why we might use scatter graphs, for example, rather than showing that in tabular form. So getting the selection right is really important. But actually, if we think about data only really falls into 2 kind of types. Now, if you go and watch the companion videos, which are to do with selecting the right statistical test, you'll understand that there are 2 kinds of data which are broken into 4 sections. So we've got on nominal and ordinal, interval and ratio, and these fall under what we call discrete or continuous based data. So if you've got data which is continuous, then the data is generally quantitative. Discrete data are typically qualitative, but they could be quantitative when we've maybe used things like categories. And you'll see this in a moment. There are lots of options in terms of choosing the graph. So for example, a line graph and a histogram are really useful for things like continuous data sets. Whereas, for example, a bar graph we tend to use with discrete data sets. You can't use a line graph with discrete data sets. So for example, if you've got categories, so let's say you've got hit training and control training or control condition, and you are literally showing pre to post, by definition that is quite it is, one could argue it's quantitative, absolutely it is, but in essence it is discrete. You've got this to pre, this to post. But if I have, for example, recorded the peak power outputs across all the hit training in a single session in my participants, and I've got it for say 10 sprints, then that is continuous data, and that goes on our line graph. So we're going to go through this, and because picking the right graph is going to be fundamental to getting your message across. So let's start with bar graphs, and in fact the example here is from a hit-based study. So there are some basic guidelines to follow. You can only use these where you've got 2 bars. So if you've only got a single value, you don't graph it at all. Always make sure your dependent variable is on the y-axis and that your x-axis is typically larger. So in this example here, our dependent variable is peak power, and our independent variable in this case are our baseline and post hit, and we've got it for our training and control conditions in this example. Again, as referred to in the formatting of graphs video, make sure that you use small or no spaces between groups of the same level. So can you see the gap between the training and the control conditions, but large spaces between the variables. So you can see that there's a big gap between baseline and post-hit, but a small gap between the training and control within those conditions. The advantages of using these are useful when you're comparing differences between groups, as you can see here. So you can read this graph and you can see what has happened in both conditions, the training and the control group, from baseline to post-intervention. And you can use this to kind of demonstrate changes over time. So for example, we might have got this where we've recorded the data at baseline and then 2 weeks and then 4 weeks and 6 weeks, and we'd have a series of bars, for example. And the beauty here is you can really very, very easily, as you can see here, include error bars, and you can see the error bars quite clearly on the graph. The disadvantages are it does make it harder for the reader to actually interpret the information. They've got to do a little bit of the reading because they've got to kind of make the inference, well, if I look at the baseline here, in the control group, it's probably about a score of 8.5 watts per kilogram. So it's a little bit harder to interpret information. But in essence, it's where you are comparing groups is where you're going to use your bar graph. What about using bar graphs which are stacked? And you often see these used, and you see these used a lot in financial reports, not so much in scientific reports. So in this situation, you'd have a single bar like we've got here, which is some information to do with household expenses. So a single bar is commonly a single variable, and then what you have is the levels are within the bar. So this example here, you've got the expenses, and it's the percentage of the overall expenses within 2 months. So you've got January, which is in black, and February, which is in grey. So it means then, actually, for the reader, it's quite simple. If they know that January was black and February was white, actually it's quite easy to see that, for example, in terms of food, more money was spent on food in February than it was in January, because you can see that area is bigger. It allows you to take the benefits of the bar graph that we've already referred to, but actually makes the comparison slightly easier. The disadvantages is it's much harder to make comparisons within a level, okay? Because the one thing that you're still doing is you're still asking the reader to kind of interpret off the scale. You also can't apply error bars to this information, which means that scientifically these are inappropriate graphs to use, because those values are generally going to be based off either a mean, in which case we really need an error bar, or if we're using a percentage, then there are actually better ways to present this, such as the pie chart we're going to look at later on. So it'd be unusual to use stacked bars. But line graphs are very common. We've got 2 examples of line graphs that you can see here, actually both from the same study. So you use line graphs where you've got at least 3 data points. Okay, and that's the distinction. It's not groups, it's points. So you've got your bar graph where you've got groupings. Here you've got data points. But you don't want more than 4 lines. Now if you look at the top graph, that is 4 lines. And you can see even on that graph there's an awful lot going on. And if you imagine there was a 5th line, it would start to become quite hard to interpret that information. Dependent variable, as ever, is on the y-axis, and the x-axis is typically always longer than your y-axis in terms of kind of the format of the graph. Again, as we referred to in the formatting video, geometric shapes, unambiguous data points. So if you look at the top graph, you can see that each line has got a different shape on that, and you can also see that the asterisks have been used because they're denoting there must be some significant difference. And then make sure that you use not only unambiguous shapes, the geometric shapes, but make sure they are different so that it's obvious that you can see the difference between them. So why would you use these? Well, it's about showing changes in your dependent variable as a function of the independent variable. So in this case, how did our stroke volume change? We've actually got it in 4 different conditions of the menstrual cycle here. but how did it change in response to the independent variable, which is the percentage of VO2 max. But you can see how that wouldn't work as a bar graph, because that is not the appropriate way to show that information. It's a time-based, in this example, or a workload-based response. So it is really useful to use line graphs when you're showing trends or changes over time, and you can see that in the second graph. Now the second graph is interesting because we've taken the decision not to show error bars, even though this is, data. You think, well, why is there not error bars? Well, this is showing individual responses. So each data point actually reflects a participant. So you can see the participants' responses, and this is just showing their change in VO2 across the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle. So it's over time, and we're showing the trends over time. So there's no error bars. The error bars are only in the top panel because they are averages for the group as a percentage of the VO2 max. The disadvantages, I suppose, is that you don't get with these exact values, because again, yes, the value is on there, but you're asking based on perception. The individual's got to kind of make that interpretation against the y-axis in terms of what that value is. It's generally lined up very neatly against the x-axis because that is your independent variable. So it is difficult to make that interpretation. And it is harder to apply error bars. You can see in the top one that we've got away with it here by really using a variation of positive and negative error bars, so that we try and avoid the overlap. But you can see that it becomes quite hard to apply error bars where you've got multiple lines on a graph. If there's a single line on the graph, it's absolutely fine to apply that kind of error bar. Histograms. So this is actually a histogram in relation to the distribution of type 1 muscle fibers, but they are used to describe frequency distribution. So again, if you're unsure what that is, if you go back to the video which is about reporting your data, one of the things that is fundamental in the report is making sure that you show whether your data is normally distributed. And so you do frequency plots. So this allows you to look at the idea of continuous data, and it's kind of these series of connected bars. You would have them with either this very, very small gap, or you would ideally have them all connected. So the height of the bars is the frequency. So in this case, the frequency is denoted by the distribution of percentage of fiber types. So the taller the bar, the higher. And what you're trying to see is the data normally distributed? Do you get the bell-shaped curve response? And we're fairly close here on a bell-shaped curve. It is used to show just a single variable. So you would use this if you're trying to show in your data set whether you have got normal distribution for whatever the variable is of interest. I don't know, let's say that you've taken a group of students and you've measured height. You'd want to see if you've got normal distribution for height. So there's some real advantages to using these. The continuity of the variable is expressed by the shape of the graph. So actually the shape of the graph allows the reader actually very simply to interpret what's going on. They can understand if they haven't got a bell-shaped graph, you haven't got normal distribution. And so they can understand which way the data is then being skewed. And that's where you get the notion of skewness and kurtosis. So we can actually see what the shape of the graph is, and we can see where the data is being skewed. So we can make an interpretation from the graph very, very easily. But there are natural disadvantages to using these graphs. Easy to generate from a stats package, but actually a lot of people are not familiar with these. They are very much a scientifically orientated graph. You have to understand about normal distributions to be able to interpret the graph. So one of the things to think about with graphing is who your audience is. Now, if you're writing a scientific report, you're expecting to be writing for people who've got scientific knowledge. So they should understand and will be expected to understand that kind of histogram. But that is a natural disadvantage of these graphs. Then we've got box plots. And box plots are a really neat way of representing the data because they go with the histogram. And they're kind of showing what we call the measures of central tendency. So in that box plot, what you're able to show is you're able to show the spread of the data, that is your error bars. you're able to show the median value and you're able to show the mean value within that group. So you're actually showing the spread. So you can actually, with these, you can show things like median, mean, mode, and you can show the error bar. So a very, very nice way of representing the data. So it enables us to demonstrate what are called fractals, really kind of the way in which the group is divided up, maybe into things like quartiles, for example. And you can start to see outliers. So if you look, for example, at panel B, there's an awfully big difference between the males and females in the way in which that data is being distributed within that group. You can see that if you look in the males. See the females, that the line is very much central within its box. In the males, the line is very much to the lower end of its box. But what you don't get from these, which you do get from a histogram, is you don't get things like distribution, and you can't understand things like what we call bimodal and unimodal distributions. That is really, when we think about bimodal and unimodal, it's the notion of it's whether we get a single curve or multiple curves in the data. It kind of all gets hidden in the box plots. But box plots are a really neat way of showing your data. Scatter plots are really only used where you are comparing two variables, and these are used for associations. Whether you're using multiple regression or you're using a correlation, you would generally perform these, for example, if you've run a Spearman's or a Pearson's correlation. Your dependent variable is always on the y-axis, and the x-axis, as ever, is generally formatted longer. So here our dependent variable is our delta VO2, and our independent variable is the maximally accumulated oxygen deficit. And they're actually fairly easy to interpret. It's a graph of association, and it is the association between two variables. And so what you can get from this is you can get an understanding of linearity, and you can identify things like outliers. So these are very, very useful if, for example, you're trying to identify variability in your data. And that is, again, go and refer back to the statistics video, where you understand the difference between what is an R value and an R squared. But an R squared value, which can be plotted from these, shows you the variability in the data. The disadvantage is, well, it's not a causal relationship, and I don't know whether that's a disadvantage actually really with the graph, but it's a disadvantage with our interpretation. These don't show causality, they just show association. They just show that the parameters are associated. And you can only present two parameters at a time, so you may end up having multiple scatter plots in order to be able to show the range of variables that you want to record. And then finally, pie charts. So some basic guidelines with pie charts. Make sure that when you're putting these together, if you're going to use them, don't have more than 5 wedges in a pie chart. Beyond that, it becomes almost impossible to interpret any information from them. You always make sure, can you see, you always try and make sure that the largest slice is at the 12 o'clock position. Interestingly, in this example here, they're not that obvious in terms of doing that, but the largest slice I really should be at the 12 o'clock position. You can, in software packages, dislodge or isolate wedges. You can pull them out to make a point. But don't do that with all of them. Do it with, a slice that you think is fundamental to making a point. There's something really important about it. You can dislodge it from the pie. They're really good when you're trying to demonstrate things like percentages or proportions or kind of chain or levels, for example. Really useful in that example. So here we've got it in relation to expression of gene types, RR, RX, and XX. So it allows us to kind of see those distributions. The disadvantages are quite clear though. These don't show negative values because they are based upon percentages. We cannot have a negative percentage on a pie chart. It's not possible. Unless they were all negative values, by the way, and then you could do it. If you've got anything which is greater than 100%, right? So let's say there was something which is 120%, you couldn't show it on a pie chart. So they only work where you've got a range of data which goes from 0 to 100%. The next problem you've got is if you look, for example, at pie chart for endurance athletes and a pie chart for female endurance athletes, we've kind of got the two groups. very difficult to make an interpretation if you compare the XX on those two graphs. I mean, you could probably suggest that it's slightly larger in the females than the endurance athletes, but it's very hard to make that interpretation. You can use colour in these, right? So we've talked about don't use colour. They lend themselves to using colour, but the issue with using colour is what was referred to in the formatting video, is that colour precludes a lot of people from accessing your information because of things like colour blindness and an inability to interpret colours. So you're kind of caught between a rock and a hard place with a pie chart. And so again, think very carefully about when to use them. So when you're putting your graphs together, make life easy for the reader. Think about, am I comparing groups? Therefore it's probably a bar chart. Am I comparing over time? Then it's going to be a line plot. Am I comparing an association? It is going to be a scatter plot. Am I looking at a distribution? It's going to be a histogram. Am I looking at percentage changes or percentages in my population? It's possibly going to be a pie chart. So think very carefully about how to pick the right graph for the job.